Okay, so we're diving into these Reddit discussions about this Trump-Vance Zelensky meeting. And let me tell you, it's like opening a Pandora's box of opinions. People from literally all over the world are weighing in. And I mean, you can just feel the intensity in some of these comments.
Yeah, I mean, given the context, right? You've got a war going on, the whole global power balance is kind of teetering, and then you have this meeting, which, let's be honest, was pretty much a spectacle. A lot of the Redditors are using words like tense, even disgraceful to describe the atmosphere.
Yeah, humiliating came up a lot too, and not just for Zelensky. It's like people felt everyone involved lost a little bit of face. Do you think there's a sense that this whole public display kind of undermines diplomacy as a whole?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the whole point of diplomacy is to find some kind of common ground, right? And usually you do that behind closed doors, not in front of the entire world.
Yeah.
This felt different, though, almost like a power play, a performance, and that's what's got a lot of people worried.
Especially with so much at stake, right? We're talking about a war in Europe, for crying out loud. America's role, what it means for the future, it's all up in the air. And speaking of things being up in the air, can we talk about Vance for a second? His role in this meeting and the way people are talking about him online, well, it's something.
Yeah, I mean, that comment about Zelensky being disrespectful, that was pretty out there, even for him.
Yeah.
I mean, where's the diplomatic protocol? Has anyone ever called out a world leader like that during a meeting? It's definitely not standard procedure, especially when you consider the power dynamics at play.
Yeah, he definitely seemed to be stirring the pot a little, and a lot of these Reddit threads are picking up on that. Some people are even saying he was deliberately trying to provoke Zelensky. What do you think? Could there be any truth to that?
Well, Vance has always been, shall we say, a bit of a lightning rod. He's got his opinions, and he's not afraid to share them, especially when it comes to supporting Trump.
So it makes you wonder, was he going rogue or following some kind of agenda?
It's possible, and that word agenda keeps popping up in these discussions. Which brings us to Trump and his demands.
Yeah, this whole deal involving Ukraine's mineral resources, that's where things get really interesting. What can you tell us about what this deal might actually entail and what leverage Trump might have been using?
The details are still a bit hazy, I'll admit, but it seems like Trump is connecting security guarantees for Ukraine to access and control over their mineral wealth, which is a bit of a head-scratcher, right? Because, I mean, you've got the Budapest Memorandum. That's the agreement where Ukraine gave up its nukes in exchange for security assurances from the U.S. and other countries.
Yeah, a lot of the Redditors brought that up and they're not happy about it. I mean, breaking that agreement, especially now, that could have some serious consequences, wouldn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's not just about the legal aspects, although those are important, of course. It's about trust, about the credibility of international agreements. If the U.S. just throws out a promise like that, well, it sends a message, and it's not a good one.
And it's a message that a lot of these Redditors are picking up on loud and clear. There's a lot of talk about power dynamics, about the U.S. taking advantage of Ukraine's vulnerability. Some are even saying Trump is using this whole conflict as a bargaining chip with Russia.
It's not outside the realm of possibility, is it? Trump and Putin, that's a whole other conversation. But yeah, offering concessions in Ukraine, it could be seen as a way to appease Russia. The problem is, it also alienates our allies in Europe, who are already pretty nervous about Russia's ambitions.
So, yeah, risky move with potential fight out on multiple fronts. It's interesting, though, a lot of the Redditors are drawing parallels to history, like times when powerful countries exploited smaller ones for their own gain. It's like they're seeing a pattern here, and they're worried Ukraine is just a pawn in a bigger game.
And that historical context is so important, right? Because it helps us understand why people are so freaked out. We've seen this movie before, and it usually doesn't end well for the smaller country.
And then there's the way Trump reportedly went about making these demands. People are using words like bullying and threatening. Some even commented on how uncomfortable Zelensky looked, almost scared at times.
It goes back to that idea of political theater we talked about. It's not just about the words, it's the delivery, the audience. Who's Trump playing to here? His base? Putin? Is he even trying to find a solution? It's probably a mix of all three, which makes the whole situation even more confusing.
And unpredictable, right. And of course, the whole world is watching all of this play out. Reactions are all over the map. Shock, outrage, some cautious optimism sprinkled in. So I guess the next question is, what does all this mean for the future? What are the long-term consequences of this meeting? Let's dive into those reactions and see if they can give us any clues.
You know, it's kind of wild seeing how the world reacted. It's like this whole thing just exposed all these fault lines. Like everyone's looking at the same event and seeing something totally different. You've got people praising Zelensky as a hero for standing up to Trump, and then others are calling him like ungrateful or even weak for not taking the deal.
Yeah, it's almost like this meeting became a Rorschach test, people just projecting their own ideas about leadership and what it means to be strong on the world stage. But you're right, there's definitely a split in how people are viewing Zelensky's response, especially on Reddit. Like, a lot of folks, especially in Europe and North America, they're praising his courage, saying he refused to be bullied, that kind of thing. But then you've got this other group, a lot of them seem to be pro-Trump, who are basically saying he made a huge mistake. Like, they're worried he just played a losing hand and might have just made things worse for Ukraine.
And that's the core of it, isn't it? This wasn't just a personality clash. It was like two different worldviews colliding. Like, on one side, you've got the folks who believe in a rules-based system, diplomacy, working together, all that. And then on the other, there's this rising tide of nationalism, go it alone, put your own country first no matter what. And this meeting, well, it just threw those two perspectives into a head-on collision.
Yeah, like watching tectonic plates shift and everyone's trying to figure out where they stand. And speaking of tectonic shifts, what about the U.S. and Europe? Earlier you mentioned that some of our European allies are kind of uneasy with how Trump's handling things. What happens if this whole thing pushes those allies away? What are the long-term consequences there?
Well, that's a big one because the U.S.-Europe relationship, I mean, that's been the foundation of global stability for decades. But now you've got this growing sense of, I don't know, disillusionment with America's leadership. And at the same time, Europe's thinking maybe they need to rely on themselves more. And if that keeps up, well, it could unravel a lot of things, but defense, trade, even just shared values, that cultural connection. Imagine a world where NATO's weak, trade wars between the U.S. and Europe, that whole bond just falls apart. That's what we're risking if this rift doesn't get fixed.
It's not just Europe either. You look at these Reddit threads, people from all over are chiming in, worried about America's foreign policy. They're saying it's unpredictable, that we can't be trusted anymore, that kind of thing. It's like this meeting just took a wrecking ball to America's credibility on the world stage.
Exactly. And that's the problem. The U.S. has always presented itself as, the good guy, the champion of democracy, a reliable partner. But then you have stuff like this, and it just makes everyone question those claims. It creates an opening for other players, China, Russia, to step in and say, hey, we do things differently.
Yeah.
And that could completely change how the world is run, who has the power, all of it.
It feels like the whole world's holding its breath, just waiting to see what America's going to do next. Will we keep going down this road alone, or are we going to try to fix things, rebuild some trust? Feels like the stakes couldn't be higher.
And the highest stakes are right there in Ukraine. Remember that deal we talked about, the one for Ukraine's resources? Well, from what's floating around on Reddit and some news outlets, it sounds like Zelensky said no. He refused to sign it.
Wow, that's a gutsy move. Taking on a superpower like that, talk about David and Goliath. I mean, people on Reddit are blown away by it, but they're also scared for him. Some think Trump might retaliate, hit them with sanctions or cut off military aid. Others are saying that this could backfire big time and leave Ukraine wide open to Russia.
It's definitely a gamble. But maybe Zelensky thinks he has other options, maybe support from Europe. They've been pretty vocal about backing Ukraine lately. And this brings up a big question. Could this be a turning point in the whole conflict? What if Ukraine starts moving away from the U.S. and gets closer to Europe instead?
It's an interesting idea, and it's definitely getting a lot of attention on Reddit, especially in Europe, where there's this feeling that maybe this is their chance to step up, strengthen ties with Ukraine, balance out U.S. influence, that kind of thing. But can Europe really provide the kind of support Ukraine needs? Military, economic, all of it.
That's the million-dollar question. Europe's got their own issues to deal with, and getting more involved in Eastern Europe, that's a big step for them.
Yeah.
But this meeting, Zelensky's move, it might just force them to rethink things. Their priorities, their relationship with the U.S., with Russia, everything's on the table now.
So we're talking about potential ripple effects everywhere. The U.S. and Europe, the power balance in Eastern Europe, America's place in the world. It's crazy to think it all started with just one meeting.
It just goes to show you how connected everything is, how even something that seems isolated can have these huge consequences.
Which brings us to our final part, I guess. We've got to talk about what all this means for the future, not just for Ukraine, not just for the U.S., but for the whole idea of a global order, working together, all of that. Okay, so we've really gone deep on this whole meeting. The tension, the fallout, the potential consequences, it's a lot to process. But I guess the big question is, was this a turning point? Like, did we just witness a fundamental shift in how countries deal with each other? Or is this just, a really crazy week in international politics and things will eventually go back to normal?
I think everyone's asking themselves that same question right now, and honestly, it's too early to tell. What we can see, though, is that this whole thing just amplified some trends that were already happening, like
Yeah.
diplomacy kind of going out of style, countries becoming more nationalistic, and, people questioning whether America's still the leader of the pack. Whether things change for good or not, well, that depends on what happens next, how everyone reacts in the long run.
In looking at Reddit, a lot of folks seem to think things are changing, and not for the better. There's a lot of anxiety about the future, not just about wars and stuff, but about everyday life. Like, will this lead to more conflict in general, a messed up economy, nobody working together on climate change?
Those are all valid worries, for sure. And the answers are complicated because, let's be real, the world's kind of like a giant spider web these days. You tug on one thread, and the whole thing shakes. This meeting, with all the talk about power and who's winning and losing, it could definitely make things worse, make it harder to solve problems that affect everyone.
It's almost like we're watching two totally different visions for the future go head to head. One where we cooperate and share responsibility, and another where it's all about competition and looking out for number one. And whichever one wins, well, that's the world our kids are going to inherit.
And that's why it's so important for people to actually pay attention to this stuff. You know, understand what's at stake, the different sides of the story, think about what the long-term consequences might be. This whole meeting, even with all the drama and controversy, it got people talking, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, it reminds us that we're not just along for the ride, we can actually do something. Stay informed, have real discussions, hold our leaders accountable.
Exactly. We can't just sit back and hope someone else will fix things. The future isn't set in stone. We build it with the choices we make.
So as we wrap things up here, I want to leave everyone with a sense of, I don't know, like an energized curiosity. Keep asking questions, keep looking for different perspectives, and just stay engaged with what's happening. The more we understand, the better shot we have at navigating all this and building a better future. A future that's fairer, more sustainable, and hopefully more peaceful.
Well said. And don't forget, in a world where everyone's shouting their opinions, the most important skill is knowing how to think for yourself. Don't just take things at face value. Question them. Dig deeper. Come to your own conclusions.
Absolutely. That's what makes a deep dive like this worth it. Thanks for joining us today, and until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.